America has become a country of the elite. How did this happen? And should an elite even exist? I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless, the show where I talk about timeless, eternal subjects. Just want to remind you that if you would like to see a news portion of the show, you can go to the Julie Noted playlist on this YouTube channel. Also a reminder that my show with Dennis Prager, Dennis and Julie, premieres every Monday, also on this channel. Now on to the subject of today. I have been fascinated by this concept that America has become a country of elitism because it's so antithetical to how I view the United States and how the United States has sort of been for most of its history. That is, we were founded on an ideal of the equality of all citizens, on shirking the sort of aristocratic tendencies and lifestyle that came with our British forebearers, our British predecessors, if you will. Isn't that sort of amazing to think about, by the way, when people talk about American exceptionalism? There are many reasons why I affirm American exceptionalism, though sadly it is dwindling. But one of them is that America is one of the unique countries that was founded on an ideal, as opposed to being founded because of an ethnic group of people or because of a religion. Most countries, and it's not a knock to those countries, it's just the way that the world works, were created because the ethnic group lived in that particular area. But America really is an exceptional country because it was founded on ideas instead of ethnicity. That being said, we were founded of this country of not being elite. But over the past few decades, and especially over the past, I would say, 5 years, we have transformed into sort of having, as dramatic as it may sound, forgive me, a little bit of a caste system here in America, where there is the elite and then there is the non-elite in the United States. And the elite controls just about everything. The media, the schools, the government, when I was saying media, I was referring to news media, newspapers, the Hollywood entertainment sector. Really, actually, the one sort of area of life that the elite doesn't control is the law enforcement, the police system. That's sort of not controlled by the elite, which is, I think, in part why the elite has such a disdain for police officers and for law enforcement. It's one of the few sort of areas of life that they haven't gotten their claws on as far as power. But the elite have exercised overwhelming influence over the past, again, really 5 years. And I'm going to provide some examples of things that we see just in our everyday news cycle that are so emblematic of the elitism that has plagued the United States. Look at one of the most recent stories that has come onto the news, that our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and the former CIA Director, Mike Morrell, were both behind that letter that was signed by 51 intelligence officials saying that the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation. One of those 51 intelligence officials, Douglas Wise, told the Australian newspaper that the signees knew that the Hunter Biden laptop story was in fact real, that it wasn't Russian disinformation, but they said that they still signed it anyway because there could be a slight possibility that it was Russian disinformation. That is a huge story, that these members of our elite, our government, came together knowing that this story was real, but instead said that it was false in order to help now President Biden win the election. Another example, the Twitter files. People who are in the higher echelons of that company, in the C-suite, getting, millions of dollars in salaries, were pulling the strings behind the scenes, trying to censor conservative content, and indeed, to bring up the Hunter Biden laptop story again, removing it from the platform in order to serve the interests of then candidate, now President Joe Biden. Even if you look again at the New York Times, I mentioned newspapers earlier. constantly the New York Times is lying or is sort of wording things in a way to subvert or undermine the truth. I'll give an example. Whenever a white person is killed by a black person, the New York Times does not often specify the race. Of course, when it's the other way around, a white person kills a black person, they will specify the race. Now, are they lying by omitting the race if a black person kills a white person? No, but they are sort of lying, as they would say, by omission. They're trying to push a narrative in one direction and ignore other facts. A lot of the omissions of the New York Times are examples of this sort of pulling the levers behind the scenes of the elite. They don't talk about things pertaining to woke issues that have infected our public schools, for instance. I talked about on Julie Noted yesterday that Colorado's teachers union, which has 39,000 workers in its group, has passed this resolution that has affirmed that they will teach their public schoolers that capitalism has exploited children and Black people and LGBTQ people, yada, yada, yada. It's really, the New York Times doesn't talk about that because the New York Times doesn't want you to know the extent of this wokeism that your kid in public school is being taught, because they are the American elite. They want to control the narrative and they want to keep their positions of power. Conservatives, and not all of them, but mostly conservatives are the ones sort of waving the red flag, saying that a lot of this stuff has gotten out of control, but they want to suppress conservatives in order to keep their standing. Even if you just look at everyday people, look at how many DEI officials there are at universities and elementary schools and high schools. That is elitism 101. Though that individual isn't being paid to do anything that is necessary. They're just getting a salary for espousing certain woke diktats. So this caste system of sort of this woke lefty class comes and sort of asserts a lot of control over a lot of our institutions and then perpetuates these lies in order to keep their standing among the American elite. Those 51 signees of the Hunter Biden letter did that even though they knew that it was wrong because they wanted to keep their standing. And so it's fascinating to sort of contemplate how this happened. Paradoxically, as the United States became more prosperous, it actually became worse off in many ways, and especially morally. White-collar jobs are more conducive to dishonesty. I think I've talked about this on this show before. I've certainly talked about it on Dennis and Julie. I met someone who grew up working on a farm, and he told me something that transformed the way that I look at professions. He said, you know, in blue-collar, everyday, nitty-gritty work, honesty is not just a virtue, it is a requirement. You cannot BS your way out of farming. You either planted the seeds which grew the crop or you didn't. It would be very clear if you did or didn't do that. Even if you look at a job of a housekeeper, maybe you can sort of BS your job, not work as hard as you may. You could steal from the people that you are working for, but it's very hard to BS making a bed. You either made the bed or you didn't make the bed. A bus driver, maybe you can collect change from the people that are putting the coins in that are going on the bus, but you can't BS your way out of driving those people to their destinations. Everyday jobs, the sort of lying and deceit and BSing is not, it can't really happen in those professions. That is very different with white-collar jobs. In white-collar jobs, when you're in boardrooms and you're in academic seminars, you can sort of talk your way into or out of things. And it creates, of course, dishonesty can be practiced by anyone, but it overwhelmingly makes dishonesty more achievable in white-collar professions. And so we see here, look at members of the government, look at members who are high-up people at Twitter or the New York Times or in schools. They can get away with pushing these narratives because it's just easier to do that in their position. They can just kind of talk their way into or out of things to do what benefits them. So what we are seeing here is that the reason why so much lying and so much deceit and BSing has pervaded is because there is a certain class of people who want to maintain their standing in the American elite. They know that if they come out and condemn wokeism, they know in the case of the Hunter Biden letter signee situation, if they don't sign the letter, their fellow people in the American elite cohort will not respect them, will not do favors for them, and so they would rather be silent and engage in dishonesty than do the right thing. To provide some definitions here, when I say American elite, overwhelmingly those are individuals who have jobs that influence or sort of control other people who they may not know or never meet. So if you look at like a factory supervisor, for instance, a factory supervisor may have influence over the group that he is managing, but factory supervisor doesn't have influence over large swaths of people in general. A politician does, a media executive does, a newspaper executive does. By the way, someone like me does. My job is totally an American elite, American establishment job, though I acknowledge that, I recognize that, and I try not to fall into the same traps of delusions and deceit that many people who also have jobs sort of in the establishment fall into. Michael Stewart has this really good book that I recommend to you. It's called The 9.9%, and he talks about these well-educated, over-credentialed, overcompensated, very status conscious members of the American populace. And it really goes in line with this sort of argument or thesis statement that I'm providing, that as we have become more prosperous, as we have moved away from blue collar, honest, everyday work and more into white collar, managerial, bureaucratic work, that has allowed deceit to proliferate more easily and more commonly. When I was at Harvard during my senior year, I wrote this article for the Wall Street Journal called "Harvard Students Are COVID Sheep." Subtle title, by the way. The Wall Street Journal chose the title. When you submit an op-ed to them, they choose it. I like the title. I thought it was gutsy, but anyway, just for the record, I didn't choose it. And I talked about how we all had these COVID restrictions that were so irrational. That was the thing about them. They weren't just oppressive. They were very irrational. For instance, you had to wear your mask as you were getting food in the dining hall, because apparently COVID lives over there. But then when you would sit down at the tables, you could take off your mask and eat the food. It was just very unevenly enforced. You could only have gatherings of 10 people in your room, but then, you know, when you stepped outside, you could take off your mask, or in other times, if you got in certain clearance, you could have bigger gatherings. The point was, it was extremely irrational. But the thing that scared me more than the irrationality of the COVID restrictions was the zombie-like acquiescence that I saw from my fellow peers. And that's what I wrote about in the article. And I just remember looking around and going, we lost a year and a half of college. We were sent home for a year and a half due to COVID lockdowns. We come back to campus. We are here for our final, in my case, it was my senior year, our final year. Why are we bowing down to these COVID restrictions? Why are we allowing this university to just have us only have 10 people in our rooms for gatherings, or have to wear masks in certain places and not others? It made me so sad. I thought that all of us would stand up against this irrationality more because we had lost so much. And then I realized the reason why a lot of my peers did not stand up, even though it bothered them, even though they agreed it was irrational, even though they agreed it was stupid, the reason why they did not stand up is because it would threaten their status in the American elite. They know that other students would give them a hard time, professors or TAs may not look at them as favorably, prospective employers wouldn't like them. They have to sort of swallow the BS, adopt the BS, because that's how they maintain their status. When they go to their job interview at a fancy financial firm, they have to recite these woke diktats in order to maintain their standing. So it really is just amazing the way that this has sort of segregated. The final thing I'll say, and it's apropos of the question I asked at the beginning of this episode, you know, should we have an elite? There is nothing inherently wrong with an elite. There is nothing inherently wrong with being a talk show host or a journalist or a Twitter executive or a lawyer or a professor. We need people like that. At one time in our history, that is what made society American society so great. But the problem is, and actually the irony is this is kind of a woke argument that I'm making, the problem is that the elite have abused their power. The elite have recklessly used their positions to lie, to sort of disregard the truth in order to maintain their own positions, in order to personally or professionally advantage themselves. And when you get into a place in society where you are a part of the elite, where you are influencing the lives of other people, again, it's sort of a lefty argument. You have a responsibility to use that power well. You have to set a good example for fellow Americans around you, or at the very least, you can't set a bad example. The final example I'll leave you is I was debating with a professor privately one day. He's the head of the economics department at a very prominent university, and he was telling me that he sometimes tells his students that maybe we should legalize polygamy here in the United States. And I couldn't believe that he was saying that. And he said, oh, well, who am I to judge, if people are polygamous? And I just thought, you are the head of an economics department at a very prominent university. This is a very reckless idea. It's very fun to think about in theory when you're in your class and you're writing your academic papers to be sent off to some fancy magazine. It's a fun thing to contemplate. But would society really work if men could be allowed to have 5 wives and God knows how many children from each of those wives? He wasn't using his responsibility in the elite responsibly. He was using it to sort of recklessly toy around with things. And I said to him, how would you feel if your son or your daughter were in a polygamous marriage? Bring this back to you. Bring this back to your society, your family, your life. And the problem is they don't. They just want to, again, perpetuate whatever lie, whatever deceit, whatever in vogue idea that means keeping themselves relevant, keeping their own standing in power. Thank you very much for joining me today. And remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. See you soon. Take care.